Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, at least 44 people are killed in an airstrike on a migrant centre in Libya. Forces of the general waging an offensive against the Tripoli-based government are blamed. Now, Sudanese generals and protest leaders sit down for negotiations again after calls from mediators from Ethiopia and the African Union. However, there's not much love lost between the two sides just days after 11 people were killed during protests. And Nigeria finally agrees to sign the landmark African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The continent's top economy's absence from the world's largest trading bloc undermined efforts to boost intra-African trade. But first, at least 44 migrants have been killed in Libya after an airstrike hit a detention centre near Tripoli on Wednesday. Dozens of others have been injured. The government based in the cities blamed the attack on General Khalifa Haftar's forces, which launched an offensive in April. Clément Bonnereau has the latest.
This is what's left of the Tadjoura detention centre on the outskirts of Tripoli after it was hit by an airstrike early on Wednesday. Picking through the rubble, a few migrants are trying to salvage their belongings. Othman Musa is from Nigeria. He was detained here along with some 150 migrants. He says he doesn't feel safe in Libya.
All what we know is we want UN to help people out of this place because this place is dangerous. We know it's going to happen like this before, but we don't have any power to do anything.
The internationally recognised government in Tripoli has blamed forces loyal to General Khalifa Haftar for the airstrike. Haftar launched an offensive against the government back in April. The general, however, says militias allied to Tripoli were behind the attack.
We have not issued an order targeting this shelter, and the site that we're talking about has been used by a militia group known as Al-Daman.
The UN, meanwhile, described the airstrike as a war crime. It also warns that more than 3,000 migrants are in danger because they're held in detention centres close to the front lines.
We have to see the immediate release of all detainees from detention centres inside Libya. And we also need to make sure that action is taken to make sure no new person rescued on the Mediterranean is returned to Libya.
Despite chronic instability since an uprising toppled Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, Libya has become a major transit point for migrants in Europe. But many who try to make the crossing are picked up by the Libyan Coast Guard, which is backed by the European Union. They end up in centres like these, where they face what human rights groups describe as inhuman conditions.
Sudanese protest leaders agreed to restart talks with the Transitional Military Council on Wednesday. Negotiations on forming a new government body came just days after at least 11 people were killed in clashes on Sunday between protesters and security forces. Rallies have been calling for the return to civilian rule after generals took over running the country in the wake of the ousting of President Omar al-Bashir back in April. Talks stalled after a June 3rd crackdown. The demonstrators in Khartoum say left at least 128 dead. Regional correspondent Julia Steers tells us more about what brought the two sides back to the negotiating table on Wednesday.
Certainly unexpected. We've heard from the protesters for the last month that they will refuse to negotiate with the leaders of the military council. But that said, there's been huge pressure from the international community, so mainly from the Ethiopian-led African Union mediation team, but also from the EU. We heard that protest leaders met in Khartoum with representatives from the EU yesterday. Representatives for the U.S. State Department said today that it's time for the two parties to come together and to finally put an end to this political crisis. So certainly while there's obvious resistance on the protesters' side, there's been a lot of international pressure for the protesters to come together with the military council to negotiate an end to the political crisis.
So protest leaders are were in there on Wednesday restarting those talks. But what about on the street? Are protesters outside of the negotiating room happy about this decision to re-engage with the Transitional Military Council?
Well, I've spoken with several people who have taken part in the protest in Khartoum over the last few weeks and months, and certainly there's a huge level of skepticism about resuming talks with the leaders of the military council. It's important to remember that the leaders of the military council are seen as responsible for the massacre on June 3rd, which killed over 100 protesters and broke up the sit-in that had been in front of the military headquarters for months, and also responsible for the continued violence that we're seeing as protesters try and reassemble on the streets of Khartoum and in cities across the country. So, protesters really see that sitting down with these men is sitting down with the people who perpetrated these grave crimes against them, and also legitimizing them to the international community by agreeing to negotiate with them.
And in terms of the content of those talks, has much changed since they sat down the last time around? What are the main sticking points of negotiations?
Well, in terms of the meat of those talks, nothing has changed. Coming into June 3rd, when the sit-in was dispersed and the protesters refused to continue those negotiations, it seemed like they were finally making progress. But these were negotiations that stalled for weeks. And the main sticking point was the composition of a council that will transitionally lead the country forward until elections can be held. So the protesters wanted greater level of civilian representation, and the military side wanted a larger ratio of military representation, which was really never going to be accepted by the protesters, because all along these protests have been pushing for civilian rule. So that will still be the sticking point in these negotiations. It's highly unlikely that the protest leaders will back down, that they'll accept anything other than a larger proportion of civilian leadership on this transitional council. They've also said that they'll only take part in these negotiations for 72 hours. So that's likely to put additional pressure and to avoid a situation like we've seen in the past, where the negotiations around this one question of the representation on the council have dragged on for weeks.
Julia stays there for us. Now, Nigeria has said that it will sign a pact to create the world's largest free trade area. Nigeria is one of only 3 countries on the continent to hold back on putting pen to paper for the African Continental Free Trade Area. A notable absence, as it's the continent's most populous country and top economy. Nicolas Chemin has more.
When talks about the African Continental Free Trade Area first began in 2002, Nigeria had been a keen supporter of the idea. But last year, just before the draft deal was signed, it backed down, under pressure from unions and businesses who feared the impact of lower trade barriers. Now, President Muhammadu Buhari says he will sign it during the African Union Summit this weekend. Today, the African continent represents a market of 1.2 billion people. It's expected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050, and the current GDP is 2.2 trillion euros. The aim of this deal is to scrap tariffs progressively, because right now average tariffs on intra-African trade are higher than on imports outside of Africa. Today, intra-African trade accounts for just 16% of the total. In Asia, that figure is 51%. In Europe, it's 70%. Analysts point out that it took the European Union more than 50 years to reach that figure. The African deal is far from being operational. Key institutions and regulations have yet to be created. Apart from Nigeria, only 2 other countries have not yet signed the agreement. They are Benin and Eritrea.
Well, 3 men have been sentenced in Nairobi for their roles as accomplices in the terror attack at Garissa University in 2015, in which 148 people were killed. Tanzanian Rashid Charles Beresero was given a life sentence, and Kenyans Mohamed Ali Abikar and Hassan Aden Hassan were each given 41 years. The trio were found guilty of being members of Somali extremist group Al-Shabaab. Jihadist shooters stormed student quarters and executed Christian prisoners in one of the worst massacres in the country's history. Now, Nigeria's growing middle class has led to a boom in the demand for meat. Much of that demand is met by livestock raised by Fulani herdsmen, who raise their herds across West Africa and often travel vast distances to take the produce to market. Have a look.
Usman has covered more than 500 kilometres with his herd. 10 days to reach the Ilele market in northern Nigeria. The Fulani breeder from Mali says the journey is long but worth it. Cows are worth considerably more in Nigeria than back home.
It's difficult to sell my cows in Mali or Niger. When I come to this international market in Nigeria, I sell them easily and earn good money. I always prefer coming here.
Once the transactions are complete, the majority of the animals are loaded onto trucks. Direction, Lagos, which has 20 million inhabitants to feed.
Cattle alone, at least we are consuming over 200 trucks a week in Lagos here because of the population.
Individuals, intermediaries and supermarkets all come to negotiate the purchase of the 1,000 cows arriving at the Lagos market daily. Prices vary between 350 and 1,000 euros, depending on the size and the cow's health.
If I buy, I will put it inside the vehicle or motor. I will take it to my slaughter. When I go, I will slaughter to sell my customers.
In the midst of a population boom, Nigeria consumes 380,000 tonnes of beef per year and will consume 3 times more by 2050.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
L'existence de l'Ebola, moi, je ne crois pas. On nous force de croire que la maladie existe.
Rumours and violence. An Ebola epidemic strikes North Kivu province in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. 1,400 are dead. But the international relief teams are not welcome. Lack of security, political discontent, and failures of communication by medical organisations are causing popular distrust. Our observers have been there to see for themselves. Don't miss their account on The Observers on France 24 and France24.com.